to the Washington Outsider Report on the Coalition Radio. For those newly joining the program, my name is Irina Zuckerman, and I am the editor-in-chief of the Washington Outsider. With us today, we have Sarah McLaughlin. He's the author of The Authoritarians in the Academy, which we'll be discussing today. She's a senior scholar at the focusing on global expression at Foundation for Individual Rights and Expression, also known as FIRE. And we are very fortunate to discuss an issue that I think has been very much rising on the radar, which is the rise of authoritarianism, its growing presence in academia, in higher ed, and how it affects as society, affects a younger generation of scholars and professionals graduating, of course, how it affects the climate on campuses as well. Thank you so much for joining us today, Sarah. Just to get started, how did this topic come up on your radar? Why did you decide to focus on that specific issue?
Yes, so at FIRE, where I work, we're a nonpartisan First Amendment and free speech group, and we spent a couple of decades working specifically on these issues on college campuses. So I spent a lot of time working with students and faculty who were having censorship issues. They were in trouble for what they teach, what they said at a protest, what they said online. And over time, I've been at FIRE for over 13 years now. Over time, I was starting to see that some of these issues around censorship on college campuses in the US were not actually about common controversies in the US. It wasn't just about guns or abortion or
Mm-hmm.
race or gender, but we were actually having other nations, especially authoritarian countries, free speech issues pop up on our campuses as well. And I think that's because because higher education has become such a global industry that it seems almost natural that if campuses are global, if the student population is global, we're going to see other nations' issues, especially the Chinese government speech issues, pop up in such a global industry.
So it's funny. I mean, it's kind of become much more part of, discourse in recent years, discussing the funding of campuses, the fact that, authoritarian regimes are inviting students to study abroad, opening up American, basically affiliates of American universities in those countries. So, in what way would you say, broadly speaking, how does the internationalization of higher education alter the traditional boundaries of academic freedom, and why is it having such a big impact right now?
Well, I think what you mentioned are some good good reasons and good ways why this is happening. Specifically, the funding and the ways that campuses have kind of expanded their reach to be part of other nations. If you open a campus in China or
Mm-hmm.
in the UAE, you're going to have to deal with what those countries' censorship laws are on the ground. So that's one way that these issues have kind of worked their way into American higher ed institutions because universities have themselves put themselves in those other nations. Another way it's happened is, as you mentioned, with foreign funding. There's been a lot of focus in the past few years on Confucius Institutes in the United
Mm-hmm.
States, which is a partnership that is operated by the Chinese government and pairs together a Chinese university with a university in other countries, and in this case, in the United States. And we did see some censorship cases that arose from that. We saw Confucius Institute directors lobby their universities to perhaps not invite a Tibetan speaker that the Chinese government disapproves of. So that's one way. And then we also see with international students themselves, there's a few different ways this presents among international student communities. One is that sometimes international students are actually dissidents themselves. And so when they come to other nations, the censorship that they experience at home follows them here. I've spoken with international students who have had their family members threatened, brought in for questioning by police at home because of what
Hmm.
the student has done here in the United States. And so that's a real pervasive fear among students. They know they're being watched, they know they're being surveilled on the internet and perhaps even by their peers sometimes. And so that's something that they have to be fearful of. And that's kind of the other part of the picture with international students. Unfortunately, some of these censorship efforts have actually been taken up by student groups that I think are more sympathetic to the Chinese government,
Hmm.
particularly Chinese Students and Scholars Association chapters. And so these camps or these chapters are at campuses across the country, and they have, in the past few years, started to involve themselves in demanding that their universities do something to censor speech on the US campus that criticizes the Chinese government. So there's a lot of different ways this presents itself, but
Hmm.
all tie back to the ways that universities either expand globally or take in students or funding from abroad.
So would you say this new borderless censorship is in any way different from the classical state censorship that everybody sort of knows about?
So it's almost that, but supercharged. So
Hmm.
I think we all know that censorship is kind of a tale as old as time. As long as people have had power, they have wanted to use it to shut people up. And
Hmm.
we've unfortunately had, through human history, a lot of people with a lot of power. But what we're seeing now is that there are new methods that
Hmm.
authoritarians can use to export this censorship. Whether we like it or not, we've kind of all always understood that uh, this is always going to be a problem within borders.
Hmm.
Leaders are always, even in free countries, sometimes always going to want to try to censor people. But what's relatively new is the reach that they have, whether it's through diaspora communities that exist in other nations, or whether it's through technology, which allows them to find, target, and threaten their critics overseas in a matter of seconds sometimes. So
Hmm.
it's kind of age-old tactics supercharged by new technology, unfortunately.
So, so who do you think has the primary responsibility in addressing the issue? Is it the universities themselves? Is it the local law enforcement in US or other Western countries? Or is it the governments and the State Department, visa providers, and intelligence agencies?
That's a great question, and I think the difficult thing is that everyone here has a role they need to be playing, and some of it is going to be more difficult than others to get them to enforce it. So when it comes to law enforcement, I think there has been some good action on that front in recent
Mm-hmm.
years. I know that the FBI has made clear that they are looking to target um, people who are responsible for transnational repression. There have been some
Mm-hmm.
charges filed, particularly against agents of the Chinese or Iranian
Mm-hmm.
governments in recent years. So those have all been good developments. And with the federal government, there are some things that federal and state governments can do. So public universities, for example, they actually have legal responsibilities to abide by the First Amendment and not to
Mm-hmm.
censor. So there are things that they can do to make sure that those universities are actually following the law. And
Mm-hmm.
they can also make sure that universities are reporting foreign funding as they're supposed to be and as they're required to do so. Unfortunately, in the past couple of decades, there has been billions of dollars in funding to hire not reported. So
Mm-hmm.
that's something that we need to actually see action on. And on the university side, it's tough. There's a lot they need to be doing. One, they need to be ensuring that they're following their own academic freedom policies, but especially when it comes to their global expansion and global engagements, they're not doing that. And what's even worse is that I don't think they're interested in even looking into or understanding the ways that they have ignored their academic freedom commitments. Because if you do so, you might be opening up a can of worms about whether you should be accepting that funding from overseas in the first place. And I think they also need to be doing a better job to protect their international students.
Mm-hmm.
To me, one of the biggest concerns here is that I've heard from international students from China who have said, I think that I'm facing attacks, that I'm under threat on an American campus, but I think my university won't care and won't take my side because they have these close ties to the Chinese government. So on that front, universities need to clean up their own house. They need to make so clear to their students that foreign funding is not going to be chosen over the rights of even just one student.
Mm-hmm.
Nothing matters more than the ability of any given student to be able to speak freely within that university.
Now, to some extent, the universities have always taken foreign funding for decades. This is nothing new. There've been chairs endowed by Gulf states going back to the 70s. But it almost feels like there's a lot more play by foreign governments than it used to be in the past. What is it about the current geopolitical landscape that has led to this situation? Is there a collapse of domestic funding that is causing these universities? Is it just corruption and greed? Is it that those governments have more money to dole out?
Yeah, I think it's a little bit of all of that.
Mm-hmm,
One is that the American universities have grown and expanded so much, and they've
mm-hmm,
kind of become these behemoth institutions that require a lot of funding. So
mm-hmm,
that's part of it. So their universities are always looking for that next funding source.
mm-hmm,
But another part of it is that I think there have been a lot of dedicated efforts from certain regimes, especially in the Gulf states, in the past couple of decades, to use international institutions to kind of bolster their image. And we've seen this outside of just higher education too. There's been a lot of conversations about what people call sports washing, using global sports and
mm-hmm,
soccer, wrestling, golf to try to improve these countries' images and to try to make them look as, just equal participants in the global stage rather than perhaps countries that have really serious human rights abuses on their records. And so I think for them, universities are a really good way to present themselves that way because from
mm-hmm.
their point of view, would American university with an elite American university with a noble history really open up a campus in a place that doesn't have human rights protections? So I
Mm-hmm.
think for them, it's a useful card for them to play.
Now, I'm going to ask something a little bit different because I was thinking about it. To what extent is this censorship by international foreign, powers affecting the research function of the universities? In other words, is there research that is being quietly suppressed or self-centered and for just as we know enough about universities being infiltrated by foreign spies trying to get ahead of US research, but what about the research that simply doesn't happen because foreign entities don't want it to come out for whatever reason, whether in the human rights arena, science function that would benefit the US government or any other area that for whatever reason they want to ensure that the US does not benefit from that type of engagement. Are there instances where valid research questions are simply not being asked as a result of financial arrangements?
Yeah, we actually know this just in reporting that came out last month in the UK, which has some of the same incentives and issues at play. There's a UK university, Sheffield Hallam,
Mm-hmm,
that it turns out had quietly forced a researcher to stop research into human rights abuses in China and in labor
mm-hmm,
issues. And she said that they told her it was because of the risk it would pose to Sheffield Hallam's ability to get international students from China to the
mm-hmm,
campus. So that's part of it. And we also know that the university's Beijing office had actually been visited by security officials in China and threatened and warned that they need to do something about this research. And then once they did, suddenly their relationship with the Chinese government became a lot better and more
Mm.
comfortable for them. And so these kinds of things are still happening. This all just happened in the past year or so. And so we do know that this is happening. The real difficult question is how much is it happening and how often has it happened? Because obviously these are embarrassing things for universities when they come out. So there are a lot of reasons why universities are going to want to make sure that this information does not come out. And for me, one of the things that's even more worrying to a certain extent is the position that individual scholars might be in. I think a lot of scholars who study issues, whether it's in business, health, medicine, politics, that relate to authoritarian powers, they know the personal risks that that could bring onto them and their families. So they might even make the decision earlier in their career, I'm only going to study safe things. And
Hmm.
it's impossible to know what that does to these fields, what it means if we have a lot of researchers who very understandably fear that they need to make sure they're only researching safe material to protect themselves and their careers.
Hmm. And the question then becomes is what is safe and at what point something that was previously becomes, a priority for somebody else for whatever reason. But in that sense, does it make sense to separate academia, educational function of the academia from the research function and perhaps relegate the research function under government control or private corporate control or something where it's not intermingled with the educational component?
I think there are other risks that come with, trying to increase government control, though, because we might have some of the same
Mm-hmm.
issues that come up just from a
Mm-hmm.
different government.
Sure.
So I think what needs to happen is that we just need to have a lot of very clear, public, and transparent protections for academic freedom, and to ensure that we don't have universities that are trying to suffocate this kind of research because of what it might do for them. So, at minimum, I think we need to be pushing on universities to be very public and transparent about what kind of agreements they're making. I mean, one of the issues we had with Confucius Institutes was that a lot of the contracts that American universities were signing with what's essentially the Chinese government actually weren't public. So that's kind of a bare minimum thing. We at least need to know what conditions exist for this funding. And that's a small step towards being able to trust that our institutions are going to produce research that won't be self-censored or silenced by the university.
Now, a lot of the top universities, such as the Ivy League schools, I think at this point it's well and widely known that they take a lot of foreign funding for various areas, including Middle East studies, including, Asian studies, and a lot of the way their endowed chairs teach based on this funding is really very much affects the curriculum and the type of faculty they hire, and even who the students who are accepted in some of those programs, especially from abroad, could be. Nevertheless, because of the prestige of these institutions, even people who are not comfortable with that are willing to go and either be indoctrinated or have to follow along with these demands, even knowing full well that there is foreign element at play. And these people then become our top leaders, journalists, decision makers. Is there any way to prevent that from happening? I mean, people are not willing to give up on the prestige of attending high profile institutions, even knowing that authoritarian states are involved in some capacity.
So it's a complicated thing because we need to make sure that we're both protecting the rights of the people in those programs because we do have to protect academic freedom. But we also need to make sure that if there are concerns about foreign influence, determining what can be said and done within those programs, that we're aware of it. So I think that's a place where we need to make sure we have strong protections for whistleblowers. And this is kind of across the board within universities. We need to make sure that if someone comes forward and says that there's illegal or inappropriate inappropriate activity happening, that they're not going to face some kind of negative professional consequence for
Hmm.
doing so. And we also need to make sure that universities have strong speech and academic freedom protections outside of that too. So if there's someone who's in these programs who is a dissenting student or academic or researcher, we need to know that they won't be punished because they hold a different view than perhaps other people in their programs. So the key here to me is that we're just making sure that we're protecting the rights of people in these programs and that we're holding universities to account and making sure that they are being transparent and following their legal and moral obligations to free speech and to the First Amendment.
Let me put it this way. Let's say you have students attending a Harvard program that is largely backed in some ways by the Chinese government, and that student then goes and becomes a policymaker working for some administration. At what point do we start questioning who makes up our government if the people graduating from these programs are almost guaranteed to have benefited from Chinese government's programming and funding, and even and it will likely this is the sort of mindset they will likely bring into their jobs, but if we have entire generations of individuals educated in those programs, how do we separate their education from their consequent careers?
So again, I think this is really a key place for transparency. It's difficult to be able to address this issue in certain ways without also violating rights because we
Mhm.
have to be careful that we don't have, for example, the government coming in and saying this is what can or can't be taught because that's where we have to draw certain
Mm.
lines with our own government response. But if we have our universities be very transparent about where they're getting funding from, what conditions are attached to their funding, then we may have a better sense of whether there is some kind of influence pressuring universities to offer certain material or teach material a certain way. And I think this is also a really important place for counter speech too. This is why part of my book is devoted to talking about people
Mhm.
who have tried to bring in speakers with alternate
Mhm.
viewpoints about the Chinese government to campus who have been silenced. That to me is so important that we make sure that we can protect the rights of people to say, I want to bring a Tibetan speaker or a Taiwanese speaker, a Hong Konger speaker to campus. And we make sure that we do not allow people to use university administrators to censor and silence those speakers because that's where the counter speech comes in, making sure that people who perhaps want to hold a different view than an academic in those programs are able to speak their mind and show students a different point of view if they're getting perhaps a one-sided take on things.
Mhm. To what extent are these efforts, in your opinion, succeeding in trying to bring alternatives and trying to hold the university's feet to the fire? Because as far as I see, um, what is invisible is just can be just as much of a problem as violent protests or the administration's open censorship. You could censorship doesn't have to be loud and visible. It could be something as someone having a conversation with the head of the department, trying to bring the speaker in and essentially threatening them with their career options later on.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's, I think, one of the scariest parts of this, not necessarily a university saying, we're going to silence and punish
Hmm.
this student group that criticized the Chinese government, but instead a university saying, um, we're instead just never going to invite speakers that hold these views. And that's kind of a different and more difficult thing to track or understand because that's self-censorship. And
Hmm.
self-censorship is a little bit more complicated and a little bit murkier. So that is definitely something I'm very worried about. And I think it's, been a mixed bag. As you ask, how effective is this? What has it accomplished? I think people have done, students have done a great job of speaking their minds. Some of the dissident international students I've spoken to, I think, have been some of the most courageous people in the United States
Hmm.
in recent years. really being willing to risk a lot just to bring this point of view to their campuses. But it has been a mixed bag. I am worried about the extent to which these viewpoints are being censored, to which people who want to criticize foreign powers think that they need to self-silence or else face consequences. But I do think, to a certain extent, the censorship is sometimes not really effective in the way that the Chinese government wants to be. Sometimes when you try to censor a talk or an event, maybe more people want to see it. And maybe people who never knew that this Tibetan speaker was coming to campus will
Mhm.
go see it instead because they knew someone tried to shut it up. So I think that's that can be really helpful, drawing attention and shedding light on
Mhm.
that censorship. I bet a few years ago there was a story about students who got in trouble for posting artwork at George Washington University from a dissident Chinese Australian artist. It was
Mhm.
criticizing the Chinese government, and that blew up and became a national
Mhm.
story because the university tried to censor it. And so I think probably thousands and thousands of people who would not have seen that artwork otherwise ultimately did end up seeing it because someone tried to censor it. So that's what we need to do. We need to make a cost for censorship.
Mhm.
Oh, do you want to silence this speaker? You want to silence this art? Guess what? We're going to make sure thousands and thousands of more people see it than ever would have in the first place.
Now, the current administration has sent out very mixed messaging on this subject. Secretary Rubio at one point threatened to pull the visas of the Chinese professors and students who are seen as security problems. On the other hand, President Trump said that 600,000 Chinese students would be entering the United States. First of all, what is the actual policy right now? And second, how are they going to ensure that, given what you said, none of that is going to be a problem?
Uh, well, what is the actual policy is a good question. It's been mixed. There were efforts by the Trump administration. They sent what they called a compact to a number of universities, encouraging them to agree to certain measures, some of which were
Mhm.
not constitutional and not appropriate. But one of those measures was to limit their student body population to, I believe, 15%. Of the international students should only be 15% of the
Mhm.
student body. So there's been that. There has been, different legislators, different government officials have made claims that they're going to not allow Chinese students in their state. They're going to push for a total ban. I don't think these things are helpful. I think there are, specific circumstances where if there are real national security issues,
Mhm.
the government can respond. But these blanket
Mhm.
threats to Chinese students, I think, ultimately end up hurting some of the students who want to come
Mhm.
here and speak freely and help make their country a more free place. So, um, I want to be very careful that we're not um, further censoring people who are already censored. So it's something that needs to be done carefully. And right now, I don't believe that there is a coherent or clear policy. So I think your guess is as good as mine of what things are going to look like in the coming months and years.
To what extent, though, would authoritarian states even allow unapproved, potentially critical students to travel to Western countries to study and to connect with Western institutions? I mean, wouldn't it be safe to assume that most of the overwhelming majority of the people approved for those international programs would have also the approval of the state censors?
I think that obviously there will be a number of people, and there are people already that we know are under travel bans, are
Hmm.
not permitted to leave. But I think a lot of the people who are going to be wanting to come here are going to be young people who perhaps have thus far been relatively apolitical, who have not taken
Mm.
much interest in politics, and so I think there are definitely people who have have never expressed.
Mm.
Um, Open or public criticisms of the Chinese government, but if they're allowed to, if they're in a country where they're allowed to speak freely, allowed to access
Mm.
uncensored information,
Mhm.
perhaps that could change. So I think that there are probably a lot of young people who some who have come here and ultimately chose to speak out to dissent, who were not particularly open about their opinions or who hadn't done um, research there at home. I know of students who came here and were finally learning about Tiananmen Square for the first time. So
Hmm.
I think, sometimes that can change when we're allowed to access information. That's when our thoughts and ideas can change.
Now, what is the legal status of the American university campuses abroad in terms of their nonprofit status? That's something that's a little bit murky to me, and I'm curious.
Yeah, it's there has not been much
Hmm.
legal action that's been done on this question. Some university leaders of these campuses have, for example, come before Congress to testify because there
Hmm.
have been congressional inquiries into how these campuses operate. But for the most part, and in recent years, there's been a little bit more of a focus on Qatari and Chinese campuses. But as of right now, universities are, for the most part, able to operate these campuses without um, much of a, uh, without much oversight. And as of right now, I don't think there will be much of disruption to how these campuses are operating. And if anything, I think we'll probably be seeing more of them expanding into other unfree countries. I
Hmm.
think there's going to be a few campuses that open up in Riyadh in Saudi Arabia in the next
Hmm.
few years. So I think we're going to be playing whack-a-mole with this issue to a certain extent,
Hmm.
because universities are not going to give up on this form of engagement, I don't think. So we're going to be continuously addressing and adjusting to it. But we do know that at least in the Chinese system, universities that open these campuses, they are operating under Chinese law, not American law. So
Hmm.
that's a pretty important distinction.
Now, obviously, varying degrees, various authoritarian states have varying degrees of authoritarianism. Some are, just mildly enforcing positive view of their own countries, while others are, essentially tyrannical and outright anti-American. Clearly, that is something that would raise a lot more concern. So, what do we do about the students who go to these universities because they get scholarships, because some of those countries are willing to give them full rides for something that would otherwise be completely unaffordable for them, and then come back to the US and take up positions as journalists, as whoever, in various institutions of soft power. Then,
So
mhm,
One thing I've been encouraging universities to do is to be more upfront with their student population about what kind of restrictions exist on those campuses. Because thus far, I don't think there's been much
hmm,
honesty on the side of universities about what kind of rules actually exist on these campuses. I spoke with one student who attended a Qatari campus run by a
mhm,
US university, and she felt that she was being surveilled by state authorities. And these are things that students might actually not be aware of, especially
hmm,
students who are in political fields. I think when we have students that are traveling overseas for these campuses, we need to pressure universities to be very upfront and honest with them
mhm,
about the reality of local law in those countries, about what kind of
mhm,
pressures the government might face. And we know for a fact that the Qatari government has pressured American universities when it comes to speech that's taken place on those campuses. So
mhm.
that's something that we need to be pressing our universities to be a lot more honest and upfront about, because I think to a certain extent they have been sending their students in blind.
Now, this is a little bit diverging from this portion of the discussion, but to what extent do you think American students graduating from high schools and entering colleges have the critical skills and the preparation to be able to deal with any sort of manipulation or censorship or ideological indoctrination? Because in my opinion, it's just as bad in the US as in, it's almost no difference whether a student is attending the school here or somewhere else. If they don't have the critical mindset, they're simply not going to ask the right question no matter where they are.
Yeah, it's something that we've been concerned about at Fire, about civic education
Mm-hmm.
in K through 12 and what kind of lessons students are learning. I mean, a lot of people, not even just young students, a lot of American adults don't even know the basics about the First Amendment, about their rights, about what the government can do with their speech. So it's definitely something that needs a lot more education. I think we need to be making sure young people are more resilient, that they can better defend against pressure to self-censor, these kinds of things. And that's something we've actually been working on at Fire. We've been starting to do summer events for high school students to help them teach them about their rights, about free expression. And I've actually participated and done sessions on global censorship. So they better understand what kind of free speech threats are originating from overseas and how they actually impact us here in the US. So that is something we're working on, and we'd like to scale up and help more young people understand, how many threats there are to their rights.
Now, at the same time, we are seeing this controversy about free speech in broader spaces. The Trump administration, for instance, publicly pressured European governments to defend free speech against censorship and disinformation laws, and while at the same time, not necessarily enforcing those laws on campuses in the United States, and second, also letting quote unquote favored regimes, including Russia and Qatar, getting away with that completely, with Russia being far worse on censorship and disinformation than any European country. So, how do we deal with this extremely mixed messaging from the US? And wouldn't it discourage students who might travel to a European country instead of to Doha or to China instead from going there if they see the US administration is currently taking a hard line?
Yeah, it's a huge problem right now. I actually have a lot of concerns about censorship issues that are going on in Europe right now, especially online censorship. But you hit the nail on the head. We have JD Vance, Donald Trump. We have them telling Europeans not to censor. But I can tell you, I have never seen this much censorship happening in the United States.
Hmm.
So I think the world's going to see us as hypocritical on that,
Hmm.
and rightfully so to a certain extent. Just last week, we found out that the Trump administration is putting forth a new policy that's going to require tourists to hand over 5 years of social media history just for a quick weekend trip to the United States. And so this is a real concern that we, are not setting good standards for free speech. I think for good reason, the U.S. has been looked to as kind of that standard for free speech, and I want to keep it that way. But it really hurts the case for free speech when the people talking about it so much are supporting free speech with one hand and censoring with the other. That does not look like free speech advocacy. That looks like partisan politicking, and it's really unhelpful. So it's definitely a real concern, and I want us to reverse course on that because um, the U.S. or the world right now has a lot of censorship issues, and if we
Hmm.
lose the U.S. as the standard bearer, I don't think we have a very good future to look forward to.
To what extent do you think this measure realigns the idea of free speech as a political alignment as opposed to a universal principle? And how do you square it with the idea of not wanting ideologically extreme people to come into the country and spread propaganda?
So I think that, on that front, I trust that the US is strong enough to be able to survive some tourists who come in who have tweeted obnoxious things before about political matters.
Sure.
I think that's a strength of the United States that we have at least until recently, had the confidence that we could withstand that kind of thing, that our rights were strong enough to hold up against it. And so I think it actually looks weak. I think it looks like we're
Mhm.
fearful of words. And uh, you know, that's kind of been one of the proud heritage of the United States. This idea that we believe that words and acts and conduct are different things. and that we're not going to stop words. We're going to deal with conduct instead. And so I think that that's we're sending a bad message, and it's also not in line with broad American values about the US being a place where you can come and speak your mind, even if people don't like what you have to say.
No, you said because it allows me to bring up the article I saw recently, which says something like 91% of not only college students but also assorted others believe that words could be violence. And I don't mean the ones that are, explicitly banned, such as, fraud or defamatory speech, which is already accepted from First Amendment, but literally regular speech and hate speech and things that normally would be protected by the First Amendment or by general concerns for marketplace of ideas. So it seems to me that signals that the what American values are is seems to be very much redefined by public opinion polls. Now, I don't know how accurate that poll was to begin with, but if there is a much broader segment of the public that believes that words are violence and is supports some restrictions on free speech, does that mean that American values have changed or are changing, or that Constitution is not as valid or as supported by the broader public as it used to be?
Yeah, so I think one thing that's important about our Constitution, about the First Amendment, is that it's meant to withstand against public opinion. So I think that's what's so powerful about it. It's if something really unpopular happens, as seems like happens once a week at this point. It's not giving the mob or the majority the power to say, okay, we don't like this. We all voted, and the new rule is nobody likes what you have to say, so you can censor it. So I think that's what's actually so powerful about the First Amendment, is that it's removed from public
Mhm.
opinion and polling. But of course, I think our rights are to a certain extent, going to be affected by long-term trends in public opinion, and that is true. And what's so worrying about, the idea that words can be violence is that it kind of directly jumbles up the difference between the two. The amazing thing about words is that you can solve problems without violence. And speech, even if it's sometimes hurtful or unpopular, it's actually the thing that allows us to address issues without resorting to guns or knives or bullets. So it's definitely a trend we need to work on. It's something that we constantly try to address at Fire, because that's
Mhm.
a really a speech issue that especially is notable in our difference from the rest of the world on that, and that we do not put restrictions on speech that's subjectively viewed as hateful, because we think that that's creates a serious risk of giving the government power to censor its critics. And there was just a couple of months ago, Donald Trump
Mhm.
explicitly said that he believes speech is hateful, or hate speech is speech that's hateful to him specifically. And so that kind of really well illustrates the issue with giving government officials the power to decide when speech is hateful or when speech is violence.
But if most people don't necessarily value freedom or view freedom, the very concept of freedom in a more restricted sense, doesn't that also sort of give a justification to foreign authoritarian regimes and sort of empowers them? Because if the Americans are willing to go along with it and the US government is not consistent in enforcing these policies, the demand for authoritarian money is only going to grow, and the public is going to encourage, or at least not to mind it, if they share the same mindset, depending on what the issue is. I mean, and we're seeing that
Yeah,
in both the so-called left and right. There seems to be a greater focus on being offended, a lesser focus on the broad protections for speech and um,
yeah, I think that there are a lot of ways that we really give a gift to authoritarians when we censor speech here. One, if we create new exceptions for speech, guess who's going to use them? People that want to censor critics of authoritarianism. But also, we help them justify their own behavior.
Mm-hmm.
I saw Jimmy Lai, who was just recently found guilty
Mm-hmm.
of sedition and collusion with foreign forces in Hong Kong. Earlier in his trial this summer, the judge in the case actually pointed to censorship that's been happening in the US and the UK to justify Hong Kong's treatment of Jimmy Lai. And their point was, well, if the US is censoring, we're just doing the same thing, but under our own rules. And so that's the real risk. We give cover to authoritarians because they can say, well, look, the US claims to be the beacon of freedom of the world. And if they're doing this, obviously it's fine for us to do it as well.
Now, when looking at all these foreign campuses, internationalized domestic campuses, did you have any specific metric on how you measure the level of authoritarian influence or censorship? And are there any, did you manage to define who the absolute worst offenders are?
Yeah, so right now, it seems pretty clear to me that the strongest candidate is the Chinese government, and that's kind of because as you ask, how are we measuring it? Obviously, the Chinese government is one of the most authoritarian countries operating in the world today, but it's also been the most effective just because of how
Hmm.
much access it has. So I think that's kind of the useful way to look at it. It has access through the international student pipeline, through the funding, through the number of academics and researchers who feel threatened by Chinese authorities, and also through the engagements and satellite campuses and programs that universities have operated abroad. I don't think there's any other country that has such extensive ties with universities in such a broad way. And so, because of that, I'm sure the Russian government would love to be censoring as much as the Chinese government is in higher ed. But right now, it just doesn't have the capacity because it
Hmm.
lacks some of the resources that the Chinese government has. But that could change. In a few years, the Saudi government has made very clear of its intent to become a bigger player in the world stage
Hmm.
in cultural affairs. So, we might see other countries start to rival the Chinese government on that front. So, a lot could change, but right now, I believe it's China.
Now, the question is, you mentioned Confucius Institutes before. A few of them I remember in Florida and I think Texas ended up being shut down. But what is their overall status in the US? Are there any remaining? Are you monitoring them, or is China shifting to some different model of, advancing its objectives in that on that front?
That's exactly it. The model has shifted. There used to be at their peak around 110
Hmm.
Confucius Institutes, I believe, in the U.S., and now I think there's less than five. So that is effectively dead as a method, and that's because there was different states were passing laws targeting Confucius Institutes. Journalists were looking into it, students were complaining, academics were, raising concerns about it. But the Confucius Institute ultimately is a relationship between an American university and a Chinese university, and
Hmm.
those relationships still exist quite widely.
Hmm.
So, are Confucius Institutes mostly gone? Yes. Are the underlying relationships gone? No.
Hmm. So what would you say is China's evolved method of spreading its own propaganda and also suppressing criticism, since that is gone the way of the dinosaurs, at least in the
Um, I,
US?
so I think the underlying academic ties, the way that China has been kind of changing its engagement model to have more students come to China for education, kind of like these joint programs, and also the ways that consular officials have gotten involved. Well, we've
Hmm.
seen consular officials arguably being involved with student groups on campus. So and I think just the larger issue of student funding from international students is a really effective form of influence because universities know that if they lose access to their international students, they're going to financially hurt a lot. So that itself is just a very effective um, tool of power over universities.
Now, while many of the states, like China, like the Gulf states, etc., have been operating relatively directly, others, like Iran, have managed to have some influence indirectly through third-party organizations, NGOs, 501c3s, foundations that subsidize programs, or, or via professors who are based in the US and who who appear to be a tool of Iranian propaganda and indoctrination. We know that Mousavian is one of the most talked about ones who recently left Princeton, probably under pressure from the US government, but there remains a number of others, and the Alevi Foundation has had a relationship with some campuses. Princeton University has had some indirect relations with Iran-backed NGOs. What is the status of those third-party intermediaries?
I need a little bit more details on
Mm-hmm.
the specifics, but I think to a certain extent, depending on the country, ultimately it's going to be a question of national security policies.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so there are going to be places where the federal government can weigh in if there's, a risk of national security issues like IP theft, things like that. I'm not sure campus by campus, like these third
Mm-hmm.
party groups specifically, but that is just on that front, it's just very important that the federal government follows the law and
Mm-hmm.
respects the rights of people involved. We had, for example, the China Initiative, which was something the federal government pursued a few years ago to pursue academics it claimed were inappropriately related to the Chinese government. A lot of
Mm-hmm.
those cases fell apart.
Hmm.
So when the government does act on these, it needs to make sure it does so in the right way.
Hmm.
So it's not violating academic freedom, racially profiling people without evidence, things like that. So I think it's a case by case thing.
So, what exactly was the issue with those particular cases? Were they not able to establish that those individuals have a direct relationship with the Chinese governments or military institutions, or
It's they were not able to defend the cases to juries.
Hmm.
Some of them there was one particularly disturbing example that was, I believe, in Tennessee, where an FBI agent had been using Google Translate to
Oh,
translate documents, and so obviously, things like that are going to fall apart if you don't
sure.
have the right evidence, and some of it ultimately centered on Um, minor clerical errors and paperwork. And
Hmm.
so things like that, you have to make sure you're actually finding real violations and not perhaps just targeting academics who are of Chinese descent, because otherwise the cases will fall apart rightfully.
Hmm. And to what extent are algorithms and AI and this sort of scrutiny of past commentary is going to be a challenge for anyone seeking to strike a balance between security and freedom?
Yeah, that's a real risk going forward, and we're even seeing it on the US front. The issue right now is I think people are putting a lot of reliance into AI to do these kinds of searches, to do this kind of review. But the problem is AI is not always going to get things right. We've even been seeing that in the student visas here in the US.
Mm-hmm.
The government intends to use AI to search people's social media posts.
Hmm.
Um, is the AI going to know actual First Amendment standards? What kind of speech isn't protected? I don't feel very confident about that. Is the AI going to understand nuance? Sometimes
Hmm.
people post things sarcastically or jokingly or as a criticism, and
Mm-hmm.
um, is the AI going to understand that? Sometimes people aren't very good at context. So that is definitely something I'm worried about, and we need to make sure that we're not outsourcing really important, life-changing decisions to a tool that has the potential to make major mistakes without oversight.
Now, the other issue, of course, is what values the actual international students bring in with them when they attend those campuses. And of course, as you mentioned, some may very well be completely apolitical or even potentially sympathetic, and it's an opportunity. At the same time, it could also go the other way around, and they could learn all the wrong ways and or simply use the US context to strengthen their own beliefs and to arm themselves for future discreditation of the US policies, while others may come in already being so biased or so favorable to censorship that they can actually cause problems. Is there any way, any study on how on the groups of international students and to what extent they have been conducive versus the opposite to this idea of campus freedom?
It's hard to say. I'm not sure I'm aware of any surveys or polling off the top of my head
Hmm.
that look into that. But I think more broadly, that's something that's the risk we always have to be willing to take when it comes to
Hmm.
free speech, right? That people are going to engage in speech we don't like, hear speech we don't like, reach the wrong conclusions. But I think that's just one of the things we have to accept as a potential outcome of freedom, and we have to trust that we're making sure that people can access material to reach those right conclusions or to reach the conclusions that we hope they reach. But if they don't, that's ultimately, people are allowed to think the wrong things or bad things. But I do think there's a lot of value. When you look back at the Cold War, for example, we maintained and strengthened and pursued connections with bringing Soviet students here to the
Hmm.
US. And in the long run, I think it actually did help those students experience freedom, um, understand freedom better, access material that was censored at home. And maybe you won't see the immediate result, but you have to, I think,
Hmm.
let people take time to learn things, to change their minds, because that can be a decades long process. Sometimes it takes people a very long time to change their minds. But more broadly, I think we benefit from having campuses where people can meet other people from around the world and learn from their experience. That's its own form of viewpoint diversity too. And there is power and benefit to that kind of diversity. So there's a lot to be gained from it, and I think it benefits Americans too, to be able to see what other people in the rest of the world live like, and to be able to campaign for their own style of freedom to those visitors.
Now, the logic of foreign influence risk collapsing into ideological writing. How should the US government draw the line between preventing foreign regimes and their representatives from essentially trying to turn American campuses into their own tools versus allowing a diversity of thought and not censoring people and preventing people with disagreeable viewpoints from entering the country?
To me, what I really would like to see there is instead of treating visas as a way to address that, making
Hmm.
sure that universities are living up to their legal obligations. So that to me is where the real burden needs to be. We need to make sure universities are not violating their community members' rights by silencing researchers, silencing speakers, silencing students. So rather than trying to, predict what a student might say or believe in the future, we just need to make sure our universities are following by their
Hmm.
legal and moral commitments to free expression, and they're not being used and abused in that way to censor speech and to censor criticism. And that's where the real work needs to be done, rather than trying to make the federal government the
Hmm.
thought police at the border. I'd much rather we
Mhm.
stick to the existing legal obligations rather than make this a border question.
Has the current administration done a good job of trying to enforce that? Because we keep hearing on the news about the various fights between universities and the Trump people over various ideological things, but more, to some extent, some institutions committed to some forms of reform, but mostly it seems to be involving, issues of anti-Semitism and so forth, and less issue of broader censorship, foreign aligned influence, and things like that. I'm not hearing much about that at all, and whether these payouts by the administrations, where are they even going? Are they going to strengthen the U.S. government funding for protecting free speech? Are they just disappearing into the black hole of general treasury? And are
Um,
they in any way effective at achieving any sort of agenda?
Unfortunately, the federal government has been grievously overstepping its authority. A lot of people have, sometimes for good reason, want there to be some extent of reform in higher
Hmm.
education in the U.S., whether it's because of, tuition costs or First Amendment violations. But it has to be done in a legal and appropriate way. And that has not been the Trump administration's way. So, whether it's a good or bad thing, what they're trying to get universities to do is sort of a separate question because the primary question is it constitutional? And
Hmm.
for the most part, it hasn't been.
Hmm.
So, we just have to automatically reject any kind of so-called reform that also creates First Amendment violations because you don't fix the First Amendment violation with another one. No, it's not been going well, to put it broadly.
Yeah, I was wondering about it because there seems to be a lot of reporting on what happens, but not analysis of whether, it's right, whether it's achieves its objectives, and whether it's actually even, helping or hurting. The media does not seem to be covering that very well, probably because he doesn't want to end up in the same situation. But it just doesn't
There
seem to
have
be.
been some attacks on the media as well. That's for sure.
Um, so, are there, historical cases that we could be learning from in ways about how to handle this better versus worse?
I think in general, it's helpful to look at, the Soviet examples that I mentioned before. Ultimately, I do believe there was benefit, and value to that engagement. Um, but I think we also need to look back, because, the US in the 20th century did take seriously, higher education as kind of a soft power. And I don't think we really have, a strategy or a goal or a hope that we want higher education to achieve in the world today. And I think it's basically devolved into universities just trying to get any scraps of funding they can. So
Hmm.
I think that's the issue. It's there isn't a strategy. I think people can debate whether the previous strategies were good or bad, whether we were right to use higher ed as a soft power in the 20th century. But ultimately, I don't think we have much of a goal among higher
Hmm.
ed today other than bigger universities, more campuses, more funding. Um, you may think that's a good or bad thing, but ultimately, I do know that it's brought in more censorship, and there hasn't been any interest in addressing that fact.
Now, you mentioned the example of the Soviet students coming in and being exposed to freedom. But on the other hand, the Cold War was also known for its loyalty screening. To what extent does that parallel exist between those loyalty tests at different, you know, points during the Cold War and today's digital background checks?
It's interesting you bring that up because I do think that a lot of free speech people like myself see that as one of the more shameful eras of history.
Mhm.
That effort to root out communists, whether communists exist or not. And so we are definitely
Failed,
seeing.
by the way, egregiously. It actually did not achieve the purpose at all, as far as I see.
No, no, it just I don't think people look upon the name McCarthy with too much fondness these days. Uh, and so there are definitely some parallels right now with what's happening to that, and I think we should take that as a note of caution. If you can say this looks a lot like McCarthyism, then maybe we need to do some rethinking on what we're doing.
So finally, to tie this all up, uh, do you suggest, looking back at the entire book, that the greatest threat to free speech comes from external authoritarian actors advancing their agendas through money and influence, or from democratic systems internalizing their methods?
That's a great question, and I'm going to give a bit of a unfair answer of both. Um, I think that we are dealing with ever pressing threats of authoritarianism from abroad, and we need to find ways to combat that. But free nations like the US, like Europe, have not done a very good job of staying free themselves. And so we're
Mhm.
not going to be able to make a very good case for defending from authoritarianism abroad if we can't even defend against it at home. So we need to make sure that we're protecting the people here that want to speak out against authoritarianism, and we also need to make sure that are not contributing to those threats ourselves. So it's a two-front fight, and we have a lot of work to do on that front.
Well, thank you so much for giving this amazing overview. And I think personally, everyone should be interested in reading your book because everyone is a stakeholder in freedom. Everyone is a stakeholder in our educational system in and its various aspects, and everyone is a stakeholder in ensuring that we have a continuity of the tradition that made this country great, strong, and and of interest to everyone around the world. What we don't want to is end up in a place where we're imitating the very people everyone ran from to get here. So
Yeah, completely agree.
thank you so much. And for everyone watching this, we'll be back next week, the Washington Outsider Report on the Coalition Radio, 9 p.m. Tuesday night. And thank you, Sarah. I hope everyone sees your book, gets it ASAP, and reads it, engages with it, and thinks about these issues.
Well, thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Have a great day.
You too.